Crime Fanatic Friday, an author whose best-selling book led to his demise. In the southwest corner of Poland, on a cold December day in 2000, three friends were casting when one of them noticed something floating by the shore. At first, they thought it was a log, but as it drew closer, they quickly discovered that it was a dead body. The police were called and the corpse was carefully removed from the water. A noose was around his neck and his hands were bound behind his back. The rope had once connected his hands to his neck, binding this man in a backward cradle. This position was excruciating, as the slightest movement would have caused the noose to tighten further. A pathologist reported that this man had been starved before he was murdered and was still alive when he was dropped into the water. The victim was 35-year-old Dariusz Janiszewski, who lived 60 miles from where his body was discovered. A major investigation was launched, but after 6 months and no leads, the case went cold. 3 years later, a detective picked up the case and was determined to solve it. He retraced Janiszewski's last steps and found out that he had met up with a customer for business outside of the office but couldn't find out who it was. At one point, the detective realized that Janiszewski's phone was never found. He knew that cell phones often bear a serial number from the manufacturer and soon found a match with the receipt obtained from Janiszewski's wife. What he found next shocked everyone. Crime Fanatic Friday Part 2, an author whose best-selling book led to his demise. After the detective searched the serial number for the missing phone, he found that it had been sold on an internet auction site just 4 days after Janiszewski disappeared. Investigators quickly found the seller to be 30-year-old Polish author Krystian Bala. The detective checked Bala's background and discovered a recently published novel called Amok. This crime novel quickly became a bestseller in Poland. It was about a bored Polish intellectual who murders a female lover for no reason and conceals the act so well that he's never caught. When the detective read the book, he found many details about the murder in the novel eerily familiar. The method of the noose that was tied and the weapon that was sold on the internet website was similar to the phone being sold. This detail was never released to the public by police and was too extraordinary to be a coincidence. However, the detective knew that this alone wasn't enough evidence. The only thing tying Bala to the crime was the cell phone. When they searched his profile on the online auction, they made a curious discovery. He had looked for a book about strangulation and tying a noose. As they dug deeper, questioning people close to Bala, prosecutors believed the motive for killing was tied to jealousy. Bala had assumed that his estranged wife was having an affair with Janiszewski. He was sentenced in 2007 and found guilty. He's serving a 25-year sentence. Storytime about my paranormal experience in the mountains. My best friend and I live by some canyons in California. We love to take day trips in the canyons to get away from the city noises. We are always cautious of where we park and who's around us when we go because it's always just the two of us. At this time, we were 17 and had driven all the way up to the top where the road was blocked off. We parked, kicked back, rolled down the windows, and enjoyed the fresh breeze in silence. Since we were pretty high up in the mountains, there weren't any homes, stores, and especially no phone or radio service. The little parking place was basically the edge of the mountain, so if anyone was to fall, they'd go straight down to their demise. There weren't any bushes or trees to break any falls. After about 30 minutes of relaxing, we hear what sounds like a woman groaning in pain. We look at each other in confusion because there wasn't anyone around and the next parking spot was another 10-minute drive down. It was around 7 p.m. and the sun was already setting. We ignored the sound since we only heard it once, but after about 15 minutes, we talked about the noise and decided to try and figure out what it could be out of curiosity. Right then, we heard it again, but it was louder. We thought someone might be hurt, but again, no one should be around because there weren't any walking trails and it was impossible for anyone to be below or above. This is when we stupidly got out of the car and used our cell phone flashlights to look around. Part 2 of my paranormal experience in the mountains. We double-checked to see if anyone was there, but we saw nothing. That's when my friend called to me, telling me that she had a bad feeling. Right before I had the chance to ask her about what, her body jolts closer to the edge of the mountain. At first, I thought she was pulling a prank, but the look on her face was of pure shock, followed by her bursting out in tears. I started to panic and tried to calm her down, but from a distance coming up the road, seemingly out of nowhere, we saw an older man limping towards us. He had dirty, torn-up clothes on. There wasn't any blood or noticeable injuries on him, but the fact that he was limping towards us alone and far away from any trails creeped us out. I snapped my friend out of it and we ran to our car. We locked the doors and pulled out of the parking lot. The man was nowhere in sight as we made our exit. After about 20 minutes driving back down, we see the same man limping. There was no way he could beat us going down the road. I asked my friend what happened earlier and why she was crying. She said she felt the urge to jump and felt like someone had pushed her. The next day, a friend tells us that apparently a month prior to this incident, a man, his wife, and only daughter had died up there. No one knows exactly what happened, but the woman's body was found at the bottom. The man's body was found in a car crash where we saw him the first time, and the daughter's body was nowhere to be found. Storytime about how a stranger hunted me through a national park. I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington near Mount Rainier. Not the official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected to see another human for miles. One night, I wake up and hear something. I open my tent and was surprised to see a guy sitting where my fire had been, right outside of my tent. He looked like a regular guy, but he was sitting just a couple feet away from my tent and it made me uneasy. I also noticed that he didn't have a bag or pack or anything with him. When he saw me open my tent, his eyes widened like he had just seen a ghost and he bolted off. It shook me to my core at first, but over the next day I managed to put it out of my mind. I thought to myself that it was just an odd occurrence and that guy was probably on drugs or something. I made myself believe that he had somehow managed to set up a camp not far from mine and it was just a coincidence. 2 days after this, I had hiked another 15 miles in totally random directions that nobody could take the same path as on accident. I was sitting by the fire that night and I started hearing noises. I was convinced there was someone there. I called out to them and out of the darkness, someone asked me, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I quickly said no and I don't even think that's a real place there. However, they kept talking to me from just out of my line of vision. It only got creepier from here. Part 2 of how a stranger hunted me through a national park. I grabbed my flashlight and tried to see them, but they yelled at me to aim it away. This spooked me, and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person, I did. After about 15 minutes, the voice was still asking me random questions from the darkness. I was so freaked out and it sounded like it had gotten closer. I built up the courage and shined my light in the direction that the voice was coming from. It was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. I realized that he had to have followed me almost 15 miles over 2 days because there was no way that he could have just accidentally wound up in the same spot in such a vast wilderness. At this point, I knew it was no coincidence. As soon as my light hit him, he took off again. This time I started to chase him, but I didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark and stopped after only 100 to 200 feet. I decided the trip was over the next morning and hiked back over 3 days, constantly doubling back and trying to throw anyone off my trail. I would also occasionally hide and wait to see if he would come by following me. On the first night hiking out, I heard what sounded like a person walking in circles outside of my tent twice, but by the time I mustered the courage to look, there was nothing. The whole hike back I had knots in my stomach. I almost cried when I finally got back to my car and the relief washed over me. Story time about my scariest experience being home alone. When I was 14, I lived with my grandparents. They lived in an old bungalow type of house. It was 1 story and we had stairs that went right up to the attic. No one ever used the attic and it was just used to store things. My room door was near the stairs leading up to the attic, which I hated because I always got scared something would crawl down when I left my room. One night, my grandparents had to pick up my aunt's family from the airport. They wouldn't be back until early morning. I told them that I'd be safe at home overnight. We lived in a gated community with guard dogs and I thought everything would be okay. Before they left, we had an early dinner and I was stuck doing the dishes. While I was doing this, I could hear the neighboring dogs barking a lot, but I didn't think much of it because they always did that. After cleaning, I locked every window, shut off the lights, and headed to bed. When I entered my room, the lights were on and everything looked completely normal. I had barred and tinted windows because my grandparents didn't want anyone peeping in my room since it was a 1-story house. They were barred because when my uncle was younger, he'd always sneak out, so they put bars on the window to prevent him from doing that. When I turned off the lights to go to bed, I saw a silhouette of a man illuminated by the streetlights standing outside of my window. I thought I was hallucinating. When I turned on the lights, he was gone. When I turned them off, he was there. Part 2 of my scariest experience when I was home alone. When I turned the lights on and off the 3rd time, the man's figure wasn't there either time. I sighed in relief and thought my mind was just playing tricks on me or that something was casting a shadow. I double locked my door to be safe with one on the doorknob and one of those latch-type locks. I tucked myself in bed and tried to fall asleep even though the dogs were still barking outside. When I was finally falling asleep, I heard something above me moving, something in the attic. I pushed the thought down and hugged my pillow, telling myself it was just rats. My heart sank when I heard someone hurriedly go down the stairs and stop at the bottom. I covered myself with a blanket and waited, wishing my grandparents had given me a phone for a time like this. Suddenly, I heard my doorknob being gently fiddled. I wanted to vomit when I heard a click followed by a quiet turn of the knob. It turned, but it didn't budge. When they noticed, they tried to push it. I finally stood up and softly pushed my body against the door, locking everything up again. I didn't want to make a sound. I don't know why they stopped, but they did. Then I heard footsteps go up the stairs as I sat there. I saw something move in the corner of my eye, and there outside of my window was the shadow. I forced my eyes closed and ignored it until I fell asleep. All I remember is the next day I was having breakfast with my family. I brought it up to my grandparents, but they scoffed that it was probably rats. I never brought it up again, but the attic window had been opened. This is why you never truly know someone. When I was 10 years old, I met my best friend. We were pretty much inseparable. All throughout school, we were always by each other's side. Our last names both started with J, so we had almost every class together. He was a smart kid and a model student. However, his home life wasn't the best. He also had ADHD and was bipolar. My family was like a second family to him. As we grew into adults, our views differed on what we wanted to do with our lives. He had his first child when he was 18 and split up with the child's mom, so the thought of college never sat well with him. He worked a 9-to-5 job instead to support himself. By 21, he met another woman and had a child with her. This time he was doing good. He stayed with her and was taking care of both of his children. I was really proud of him for stepping up and getting his life together. Suddenly, something inside him flipped like a switch. He randomly up and left that woman and moved to another state. I hadn't spoken to him for 2 months after he did this. One late night, I was woken up by a phone call from his mother saying that he was in jail. I asked what for and she told me that he raped a 15-year-old girl. He was caught and sent to jail. He was serving 2 years behind bars only because there were texts from that girl saying that she was 18 years old. 2.5 years went by when he finally got out. I told him he could stay with me until he was back on his feet, but he refused. Then things took a dark turn. Part 2 of why you truly never know someone. He decided to stay with my mom for a month instead. Every day I would message and check up on him. I would always get the same vague answer saying that he's good and thanking us for helping him out. One day, my mom called me in a panicked state. She told me that he was in his room with a knife and threatening to unalive himself. I immediately drove over and talked him down, taking the knife away from him. Later that night, I called to check up on him because I was worried. He didn't answer. I called my mom to check on him and she said that he was in his room. I asked her to go check and when she did, he was nowhere to be found. Later, we found out where he had gone that night. Apparently, he walked over to his ex-girlfriend's house to spy on her and her boyfriend. I'm not sure what shifted in him, but he walked behind the house and ripped off a piece of his shirt. He stuffed the ripped shirt in a crack of the window and set the fabric on fire. Then he just walked away. He attempted to kill his child, ex-girlfriend, and an unknown man. Luckily, no one was harmed because the adults in the house were still awake and smelled the fire. They quickly got the children to safety and called the fire department. My best friend admitted to this and has since been in jail. After this, I stopped all contact. It's been 9 years. It's crazy to think that the closest person to you can have a deep dark side and there's nothing you can do about it.